Good morning and welcome to the 9th meeting in 2020 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. The committee has agreed that, given government guidance on social distancing, only 5 members are meeting today on a cross-party basis. Therefore, Donald Cameron, Alexander Burnett, Neil Bibby, George Adam, John Mason and Tom Arthur have sent their apologies. The first item on our agenda is to decide to consider take agenda item 3 in private. I think we're all agreed that we'll take that now in public. Therefore, we'll just go straight on to the next item. Item 2, we live in quite remarkable times, Cabinet Secretary. And the second item on our agenda is to take evidence on the coronavirus UK Parliament legislation, LCM, from Michael Russell, the Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, Europe and External Affairs, and the Cabinet Secretary is joined by Jenny Brough, who is the EU Exit Readiness Team Leader. That's what I've got here. I'm not sure what that's got to do with coronavirus, but I'm sure there's... Okay. I welcome you to the meeting, and in these circumstances of a grave national emergency, Cabinet Secretary, I invite you to make a short opening statement.
It will be very short because the details of this legislation is clear and is before you. As you say, Convener, we are living in extraordinary, difficult times which many people are finding very difficult to cope with, and the new regulations clearly announced tonight are of exceptional importance. All I would say to people is that the intention of this legislation is to try and keep you, your communities and your countries safe, and to make sure that we work our way through this in as best a way as we possibly can. This is a UK-wide bill, but there are specific Scottish items which I hope we will approve today and later today within the Chamber. We will be bringing further legislation very, very shortly. Next week, I anticipate to take more measures, and no doubt we can discuss them then. But this is designed to try and help, and everything we do will be the same.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I should have said, as we come to speak, if we just leave it a minute after I call your name to allow the mics to flash on in front of you. Some of the reports this morning, Cabinet Secretary, around firms such as Sports Direct had suggested that they'd considered staying open. I understand that decision has now been reversed, which is good. But that leads me to the question and the powers in the bill. Will the Scottish Government have powers to close down premises who are not considered essential but decide to stay open? How quickly can this be done? I understand it's obviously a very fast developing situation. There is confusion in some quarters about what constitutes essential business or essential travel. I understand the First Minister may well be making a statement this afternoon. But as well as the first couple of questions I had for you, I just wonder if you can give us any guidance at this stage on that matter, which is causing, I know, significant concern to a great number of constituents.
It is, and all of us will have received very substantial email and other contact over the last few days, and that will continue. Can I take that in 3 separate parts? First of all, this bill does give the powers both to give directions related to events, gatherings and premises, that is Clause 50 and Schedule 21, and also to make health protection regulations, Clause 47 and Schedule 18. And there are other parts of the bill that do different things, including closure of schools and closure of educational institutions and childcare premises. But there are powers in this bill to enforce the regulations that were discussed and were notified last night, and they will be used if they are required. Obviously, we would much prefer that people took this with the utmost seriousness and followed the rules, as the First Minister has said, to the letter. Now, of course, interpretation is difficult. This is a fast-changing and emerging situation. The Scottish Government will publish further information, both on essential premises and on key workers, but it is absolutely essential that people apply the maximum of common sense to this. And let me try and give you just some examples of where this may be. Quite clearly, the Sports Direct situation was one in which there was a very strong public feeling, and it was expressed publicly, that that was not something that should happen. And people recognised that no matter what the company was saying, this was not an appropriate thing to happen. That happened this weekend in terms of pubs and licensed premises. where many people expressed their very strong concern that this was taking place. All of us will have had contacts from companies in our constituencies, and I've had contacts from national bodies that want all their workers recognised as key workers. In reality, if that were to be the case, these regulations would mean nothing. I was approached yesterday, and I'm sure they don't mind me saying so, by the national newspaper publishers. Clearly, there are certain things within their work that are absolutely essential. The dissemination of information, the printing of newspapers, distribution of newspapers, the writing of newspapers, there will be people that have to be engaged in that. But that is by no means all the people who work for those newspapers. In fact, they themselves, looking at it very closely, thought there probably was a comparatively small percentage of people engaged in that. So if you can do your job from home, do your job from home. If employers bust a gut in order to make sure that people can do their jobs from home, that will be very helpful. But where there are circumstances in which people require to go out for the national or local good, then of course that will be permitted. At the present moment, use common sense, look for guidance, and we'll try and get that guidance online as quickly as possible. Ask, if it is possible to ask people online or elsewhere, but also remember the purpose of these regulations. That is to keep people safe. It is to make sure that we cut connections between people in terms of social interaction by 75% or more. That won't happen if people think they can just carry on as usual. They can't.
I'll just use one example that I'm aware of where there's, I think, some confusion. I'll leave it then to others to ask other questions, and I may come back to other points I want to raise myself near the end. The construction industry, it was quite clear from what the First Minister said last night, from what I listened, that they didn't expect the construction industry to be able to continue in these circumstances. Now, I know there may be bits that are essential to the national good and safety, but that seemed to be contradicted by, on the media this morning, by some commentators from the UK government. So there is confusion out there. How can we best avoid that?
It's important that the messages from all four governments are coordinated, and we're saying the same thing. And clearly there is clearly a difference in those two messages. This morning I've just come from a telephone call into the Cabinet meeting, and the Cabinet did not meet together as a group as they normally did, but many of us were participating by phone this morning. That issue was mentioned, and we're endeavouring to clarify that issue today at speed so that we can make that clear to people.
Okay, I know Murdo has potentially some follow-ups in this area.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Just on this, I think there's two distinct but related issues here. One is who is a key worker, which is crucial, I think, particularly from the point of view of childcare, whose children should be at school. And I think, to me, the government guidance on that is clear, who's a key worker. But I can understand, as you've already alluded to, there are sectors who believe they should be in that group, who perhaps are not, and I don't know whether the government's reflecting on that at the moment, and whether there'll be further guidance issued, or whether that's set. But the second issue is in relation to the announcements that were made last night, both by the Prime Minister and the First Minister, in terms of who should be going to work. I think there is still a bit of confusion and concern in people's minds. It's clear people should work from home if they are able to. If people are not able to work from home, and the businesses are still operating, should they be going to work or not? And that's the question in many people's minds.
Yes, let me deal with both of those points. In terms of key workers, the definition that the government has been involved in up until now has been to do with childcare, as you say, and it's very clear in that. But quite obviously, there are other workers, who will require to do things. I mean, the food chain, for example, needs to operate. Therefore, the normal parts of the food chain need to operate, though probably not everybody who's involved in that needs to do the job. An example will be a company I was dealing with at the weekend, which delivers feedstuffs. Quite clearly, those people who deliver the feedstuff are essential. Those people who take the orders can do that from home. And there are distinctions to be made. It's not blanket. In terms of the definitions that apply now, in terms of going out to work, it will take a little bit of time to get that absolutely clear. Of course it will. This is absolutely unprecedented. But I would ask people to apply common sense. And the first element of common sense is, do I need to go out there? Or can I do this from home? But the second one is for employers. Employers need to think creatively about this. How much of the work can be done from home, even if it is essential work, and to reconfigure work patterns so that that can happen. I had, again, and we're all working from our experience, I had an email yesterday from somebody in a senior position whose employer was saying they had to come to work. They changed their view during the day because they began to work out how that job could be done from somewhere else. So let's look at that. Technology is working well for people. I know a lot of people are having online meetings. A lot of people are doing work from home. That needs to continue.
Thank you.
You had a question about food supplies?
Do you want me to come on to that later? Or?
Just do that now, I think.
Do that now? Okay, thank you. I was going to ask around the whole issue of food supply, which is crucial to people. We've seen lots of pictures of empty supermarket shelves because people are irresponsibly panic buying. This is causing concern, particularly for vulnerable groups, those who are not willing to get out of the house. We've seen, certainly in the area I represent, a lot of community volunteers coming forward, being prepared to help others, which is a very welcome development. But how confident is the Scottish Government, working with the UK Government and the other devolved administrations, that the food supply will be maintained and there's enough capacity in terms of food production both now and looking forward into the future to make sure we don't face any difficulties?
And in terms of the bill, what additional powers are in the bill that can help you secure that?
There is a confidence the food supply can be maintained, and indeed people need to recognise that they should not be panic buying and they should not be crowding into shops. You will see from the information published last night that a very clear plea to supermarkets, particularly to manage the people who are coming in, to maintain social distancing, to have orderly queuing, and to make sure that people are able to be safe even in those circumstances. And quite clearly, providing they do that, providing people behave in a rational fashion, then there should be no difficulty in that regard. If you look at the supermarkets in some other European countries, they are in actual fact doing better than that at the present moment. And we should make sure that we do as well as possible. The list of shops that can remain open has been published and is clear, and in those circumstances people can also get supplies from their local corner shop. For example, you and I will have many people who write to us who come from rural villages where there's only one source of supply. Maybe beefing up that source of supply is something the local shopkeeper want to do. I know that's happening in some places in Argyll, so that local shops that had a very limited range are trying to make sure they can carry essential supplies to make sure that people don't have to travel. In terms of the bill, sections 23 to 27 relate to the food supply chain. This is primarily to ensure that there are legislative powers that can be applied if information is required from individuals in order to make the food chain work properly, or to make sure that difficulties in the food chain can be assessed. I have also heard today, and some of you will have heard this from, for example, the Grocers Federation, that are saying that food supplies are being maintained, and that there's a lot of work being done through officials here and elsewhere to make sure that the ends of the food supply chain, which very often are in Scotland, food is coming through in those circumstances. I should say that we did a lot of planning for that during the two periods where we thought there might be an EU no deal. So in those circumstances, some of that work has already been done and more is being done.
Okay, thank you for that. Just as a follow-up to that question, one of the issues in the area I represent is around agriculture, where many of those involved in soft fruit production would normally at this time of year be looking to plant with a view to the harvest in the summer. Of course, the difficulty they have is looking at the availability of labour to pick the fruit, because the migrant labour they would normally depend upon is not available, so they're looking to actively recruit. So is there anything in the legislation here that's going to help in terms of looking at perhaps the regulations around employment that would encourage people to go and work in that sector? Because what the farmers are saying right now is there's no point in them going down the route of planting crops now if they don't know there'll be people there to pick the fruit in July and August.
Well, I would encourage people to plant. It would be a worse situation if they didn't plant and then there was no crop to be picked. So I think that planting is essential. This legislation does not have those provisions in it, but we are at the start of the legislative process, not the conclusion of it. As I've indicated, there will be at least one bill next week. There will undoubtedly be a further bill, I would think, during April. We will continue to look at this and to make sure that all the legislative change, temporary legislative change, is undertaken with scrutiny, but also with effect, so that we can help people. And there will be issues arising out of the harvest, and they need to be addressed.
I'm not expecting you to respond to this, but just something to take away, Cabinet Secretary. I'm also aware in the back of that some of these same people that Murdo was talking about, if individuals are working in polytunnels, what's going to be the advice to them for health purposes?
Yes.
And in a lot of circumstances, they have many homes, caravans,
yeah.
or want of a better word, on site, and they're concerned about how these might be used and how many can use them, etc. I'm not expecting a response just now. It's just something
we'll take it away
as guidance
as an
is
issue.
required on. Alec.
Firstly, could I say that this is a massive shift of power over individuals, power from government, but I would want to thank the Cabinet Secretary for the discussions that we have had. I think the Cabinet Secretary has been willing to work with all parties and explain this bill, and I think the Scottish Government have actually improved this bill by the input that they have had to it. So I would want to put that on the record. In terms of key workers, there seems to be some confusion, particularly because we've heard that 32 local authorities are defining what key workers are. So I would be grateful if you could address that, because it is resulting in confusion, but also the role of the employer. Because over the weekend, I've had different examples. I had someone contact me yesterday who worked in a gym, and although the gyms have been shut, the staff were being told they still had to come in because they could be doing painting, cleaning, etc. And that person was obviously frightened having to use public transport. So there's something about the role of employers here where they're still forcing workers to go to their work, even though, in that case, they were closed down. So I wonder if you could maybe start with that.
Absolutely, and thank you for your early remarks. We will very much continue to cooperate with all the parties across the Parliament and individual spokespeople on this legislation and on the legislation planned. As you know, we're hoping to meet later today to look at the legislation for next week and to make sure that we're all cited on what may be in it and have views on it. And I am pleased that the UK Government, for example, appears to have accepted that this legislation should not last for 2 years but for 6 months, with a renewal for 6 months, and that is very welcome, and I think that's a welcome indication from the Government. In terms of key workers and the local authorities, before I deal with employers, the reason why that definition applies, this is the definition of key workers for childcare and support, in terms of childcare centres, hubs that have been established. And it applies to that for local authorities. And that is because local authorities are the providers of that. And they will need to tailor it to the demand within their area. Some areas, for example, in Edinburgh, will have a far larger number of ICU staff and doctors than, say, my own area. So in those circumstances, there has to be a variation. There will be flexibility in some areas that there isn't in other areas. So that's understandable. It's not the abiding definition forever of key workers in every set of circumstances. But what was published on Friday was very clearly about education and childcare. In terms of employers, I entirely agree with you, and this is a good opportunity, I think, to say very clearly employers have a huge responsibility here. They should be reconfiguring their own expectations of how they do their job in order to make sure that the maximum number of people can work from home. We're not saying people shouldn't work. We do need people to work, but the maximum number of people should be able to work from home. And if that requires technological reconfiguration or it requires reconfiguration of expectation, then that should take place. And also reconfiguration of demand. If there is need for a cleaning of a gym, if it is closed, then it clearly is not going to be a need for every single day. So employers need to think very creatively and positively about different patterns of work.
And you're clear that if necessary, the government will look to use these powers and look to further powers if employers don't act responsibly, because that's the majority of people that have contacted me over the last couple of days around employment issues. That's been the key issue, the employer.
Absolutely. The powers that we have in this bill will be used as they are required, and any powers that we take thereafter will be used as required. This is not window dressing, this is not shadow boxing, this is what we intend to do. Now, quite clearly, we hope that the vast majority of people, in recognition of that, recognition of the unprecedented emergency that we are in will operate in a sensible, thoughtful, constructive manner. But the law exists to force that compliance if it does not take place.
Can I ask, through convener, in terms of self-employed, have you been able to make any more representations to the government? The UK
yes,
government?
There are continuing representations to the government. I think the indication is that the UK government will be acting on the issue of the self-employed, and that will be very, very welcome, because there's been a lot of self-employed people who've been in touch, I'm sure, with every single one of us. Each of us represents areas where some sectors have lots of self-employed people. For example, my area, inshore fisheries, has lots of self-employed people, and it is important that something is done both in the fishing sector and for the self-employed. We continue to say this must be done and is required, because otherwise it would be inequitable, but it would also be damaging in terms of what people feel they have to do work-wise.
Okay, and just one final one, convener. On Sunday morning, up in Fife, the Dunfermline Tesco had given notice that for the first hour, I think it was 8 till 9, it would be NHS workers would have access to the store. And online you could see the utter chaos, where you had all these workers queued together along with the Tesco staff. So that in terms of passing the virus, it was utter chaos. People have contacted me to say once they got into the store, you know, half the shelves were empty. So that's not a good idea. Is the government talking to the local authorities about how we actually really start to organise? And one, we need to try and stop the panic buying, but two, to actually give these I mean, that was an insult to these workers to have done that.
Yeah, I think that, you know, there's always a difference between having a good idea and getting that good idea to work in practice. Clearly, it worked very badly in some instances. In other instances, it worked well. You know, there is a clear information today saying if supermarkets must arrange queuing, they must make sure that social distancing is observed. You know, it's a very good idea to help not just NHS staff, but care staff, care home staff. I know there's been an issue that, you know, narrow definition applied, to give them some priority, but the shelves need to be full, or at least as full as they can get them. So all that needs to be thought through by individual stores and by chains of stores, and make sure it works. You know, not everybody will get it right first time, but people's lives depend on getting it right. Yeah. So I do hope they will get it right.
Thank you.
Now, Murdo Fraser's got a supplementary, and after that I'm going to Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Convener. Just, I wanted to come back in on a point that Alec Rowley raised around employees getting transportation to work. I've had this raised with me as well, where people doing shift work, because there has been an understandable reduction in both the rail service and the bus service. People now have difficulty getting it to work in time. And this applies as much to key workers, people in the NHS, as it does to those working, you know, in the private sector. Understandably, the transport companies are saying, you know, they can't run empty buses, they can't pay staff, they can't incur fuel costs if there are no passengers on the buses. At the same time, there needs to be a minimum level of transportation service to keep the country functioning and help those who have to get to work, and help people who don't have cars to get around. So what can the Scottish Government do in terms of what's here to support the transport companies to make sure we've got the level of transportation that's required to help the country function?
It's going to be a very difficult, you know, working of that out. I mean, the reduction of transportation is essential, you know, partly because the personnel will not be there to do it, and also because we want to make sure that people are working at home. Equally, those who need to go to work, we encourage them not to use public transport if they can avoid it, but some people cannot avoid using public transport, and in all those circumstances then they have to practice as much social distancing as they can, but that can be difficult. You know, when people are trying to travel in the same way, it just will require a lot of trying to organise these things in the best way possible at the present time. And we've seen pictures of London tubes which have caused great concern. There will be a lot of work being done, and still is being done, to try and mitigate that as much as possible. But it's not yet perfect, and we have to accept that. But there's a lot of work being done to try and help.
One thing has been suggested to me by one of the transport companies is that the currently concessionary travel scheme, if the payments for that were allowed to continue, even though people were not using the buses, that would help sustain their business model. Is that something that's being considered?
I've had representations from big companies, coach companies and bus companies, one in my own constituency, keeping me very well briefed, West Coast Motors. I think the Transport Secretary is trying to make sure that as much resource is being made available to these companies as possible. School contracts will have come to an end. The people will not be travelling. There is national support for business, of course, in Scotland and throughout the UK, but we will also have to make sure that there is a transport sector at the end of this, and there will be an end to this. We must keep our eyes on that. There's a transport sector that is capable then of getting back to work and isn't terminally damaged.
I'm going to go to Patrick Harvey, and provided there's no supplementaries, I'm then going to Angela Constance.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning. I've got a number of separate issues that I'd like to raise. First of all, it's been reported that the UK government will be tabling its own amendment to ensure renewal every 6 months. So I welcome the fact that the Scottish government has been supportive of that change. There's been pressure across the political parties to achieve that. Coming back to the issue of food supplies, as you know, I was a bit surprised that the bill only talks about the provision of information. And it seems to me that there is at least potentially the need for either public authorities to acquire food or other essential supplies for public distribution, or to ensure price capping to avoid exploitation. Can you say whether there are relevant powers in that area anywhere else, or could they be implemented in the devolved legislation if they're not included in this?
I think price capping couldn't be involved in devolved legislation. I think it relates to a reserve power, but I'm happy to have a look at that. In terms of purchase of foodstuffs, I suspect that could be involved in devolved legislation. I wouldn't see any reason why it shouldn't be, though I'd want to take a legal opinion on it. But we can certainly look at that. I know you raised it last week. We can certainly look at that as a possibility to make sure that it would either be possible under existing legislation or that we could put it into emergency legislation. So I will look at that, but in terms of price capping, I'm pretty certain it would have to be reserved. But we'll look at it, but I'm pretty certain it would have to be.
Okay. On the emergency volunteer scheme, you'll also be aware that I've expressed some surprise at the fact that the emergency volunteer scheme only talks about remuneration of those who have lost earnings by volunteering, rather than those who've already lost their earnings and are therefore available to take part in the emergency volunteer scheme. It seems to me that would be an entirely reasonable change to ensure that they can be given reasonable remuneration for taking part in that scheme, and that would meet both their economic need and the country's social need to have people sign up. Is that something that you've been able to explore with the UK government at all?
It is not something we've been able to explore because I think that the legislative consent process does not require us to consent to a section, that particular section. I need to check that. I'm sorry. It's this bill is, as you know, we only saw it in its entirety less than a week ago. So, but I think we are not required to consent to that. But I think we should probably have a look to see what we could do in terms of what you've identified there, and see where we go. Yes. Clause 7 is not subject to a legislative consent procedure.
I'm clear as well that it's not subject to the consent procedure, but there is obviously dialogue between the two governments.
Yeah, I'm unaware of dialogue on this issue, but I will see if we can find out if there has been dialogue, and also to see if we can make a suggestion or whether we can modify it in terms of our own legislation. That's often difficult to do in terms of UK legislation, but I'll find out. Okay.
Thank you. Another area that is not requiring consent because it only applies to England and Wales is Schedule, I think it's 29, on evictions. Can I ask whether it's the Scottish Government's intention to replicate those provisions which apply to England and Wales, effectively a ban on evictions in relation to Scotland? Because so far the policy has merely been to extend the period over which rent arrears can accrue from 3 months to 6 months. That wouldn't protect people from being given notice to quit. I'm getting emails from people pretty much every day saying they've been given notice to quit by their landlords. I've no doubt that there are some very responsible landlords, but there are clearly others who are not. and it seems to me urgent that the Scottish Government puts measures in place to protect private rented tenants from eviction under any circumstances in the crisis.
We believe there is a de facto prevention of eviction at the present moment, but it is a matter we could deal with in our own legislation. As you know, there is a previous announcement that what we will do is to change the mandatory eviction ground from 3 to 6 months. What we can certainly do, and I think you will be represented at the meeting we're going to have later today about emergency legislation, we can raise that and raise it with the appropriate minister.
Thank you. On another area which is clearly a reserved matter, but which plays out in Scotland in a way that will impact on public health, there are significant detention powers in relation to the immigration system, asylum seekers. There are people who will still be concerned that they could be subject to deportation, even if that's an unsafe process for them to go through. And of course, there have been long-standing concerns about the attitude of the previous asylum accommodation contract holder, Serco, and the new contract holder, Mia's Group, carrying out lock change evictions of residents in Glasgow, and subsequently those people having no recourse to public funds. I think the Scottish Government has said that emergency accommodation for those with no recourse to public funds will be available. But is the Scottish Government engaged with the UK Government on the question of suspending detentions, deportations and evictions of people in those circumstances?
It would be our view that that should not happen, that there should be a suspension for this period of time. And that view has been communicated and will be communicated, but that's our view, and we would encourage others to take that view.
Has there been a response?
I'm unaware of one, but I mean, we'll try and find out what the situation is.
That would be very helpful. Just one final brief question, Convener. With any complex legislation, there's always a risk of unintended consequences. With emergency legislation, perhaps more so. That's not to doubt the sincere intentions with which this is being taken forward, but we've had a written submission, for example, from the Commissioner for Children and Young People, concerned about potential unintended consequences on children's rights. A number of other organisations have expressed similar views. What is the process by which the Scottish Government will keep Parliament updated about how this is working? Not just whether powers should be renewed, but to ensure that there's a rich understanding of what are the actual consequences that are playing out from this legislation?
Well, I indicated in my statement on Thursday, and I'm happy to repeat here, two things. One is that Scottish legislation would have a maximum of a 6 months renewal, right? And that's, that seems to be where the UK government's now gone on this bill, but that's what we will do with our bill. But secondly, although there is no mandatory reporting on the Scottish Government in this bill, although there is mandatory reporting for the UK Government, we will make a commitment to report on the same schedule every 2 months on the use of the powers in the bill, and that we will put that into our emergency legislation, both retrospectively for this bill and for our own bills. So there will be reporting on the use of the powers. And I think that's the important thing, to make sure that every period, I think 2 months is appropriate, then the Parliament should know from me or from other ministers what has been used and should be able to scrutinise that. I mean, we want to make sure in these extraordinary circumstances that democratic scrutiny is, if anything, stepped up, given the nature of this bill. Now, clearly there is also the difficulty of social mixing, of the need to be aware of the requirements. As we're seeing in this room here, we can do things differently, and maybe we can do much more online. That is, I think, actively being examined. But we want to make sure that people know what's happening.
Thank you.
Now, I'll come to you, Alec, but really, to be fair, I need to go to Angela Constance first, then I'll come to Alec Riley.
So I've got a few questions with regards to Human Rights Cabinet Secretary and what that actually means in practice for vulnerable groups. But firstly, in broad terms, you have spoke about using the powers as required. The legislation talks about powers only being triggered in certain circumstances once decisions have been made. It would be useful to know, in the context of devolution, although you've touched on it a bit with Patrick Harvey, how powers will be turned off and on. And I suppose in very broad terms, if you could speak to how the bill tries to strike that balance between protecting people and their health, but also ensuring human rights, particularly those who are most vulnerable.
Yes, let me deal with the switching on and off. There are various powers in the bill that can be switched on and off, and there's a procedure in the bill to switch them on and off. The switching on depends upon certain things happening or being said. For example, the powers to issue directions relating to events, gathering and premises requires a declaration made that the incidence or transmission of coronavirus constitutes a serious and imminent threat to public health in Scotland, and that the powers conferred will be an effective means of protecting against delaying or otherwise controlling them. And the Chief Medical Officer must be consulted before the declaration is made. The declaration must be published on the Scottish Government website and in the Edinburgh Gazette, and this starts a public health response period. And there are various conditions to make that. Now, most of those could take place on the same day. Most of those will take place on the same day, because I'm absolutely certain that that will take place. Once this bill is through, that is precisely what will happen. We are in that period of transmission of coronavirus constituting a serious or imminent threat to public health. So that's what will happen. That can be switched off if we move out of that period. And if the Chief Medical Officer says we've moved out of that period and ministers agree with that, then that's switched off. But there is a mechanism for switching on and off, and that may be required. It is perfectly possible that will be required. Under the health protection regulations, which is a very wide power within the bill, if we make a regulation, it has to be made under the affirmative procedure. So what will happen is that will be, those regulations will be made, they will be laid, and they have 28 days until they have to be approved. If they are not approved within 28 days, they automatically lapse. So within the bill, there are various steps that can be taken at various times, and they're clear within each area. Some powers take place immediately after royal assent. And we anticipate now royal assent will probably be on Wednesday, probably Wednesday or Thursday. That's come forward. The procedure is today, the House of Commons cleared the bill yesterday. We will do our legislative consent motion today and hopefully have it cleared. House of Lords will meet, I think, today and tomorrow, and it is hoped that there will be royal assent tomorrow. So then those powers come into place. Some of them can then be used immediately. Some of them then require action. Now, in terms of the most vulnerable, there are issues in here, mental health issues particularly, which you know much more about than I do and are a much greater expert than I am in these matters, which are very, very severe in terms of what could happen. Now, the intention of those powers is only for them to be used when there is a shortage of staff and the system could not operate under the current legislation unless there were different powers available. But it is a very sparing use of those powers, and that is part of the reporting process. I would expect that we would want to and have to, should report, when these powers have been used, so that we are aware that they are being used and that they're examined in all those circumstances. I give a commitment, we will endeavour to do so. But we do recognise this is a time of extraordinary difficulty. And of course, the human rights legislation allows actions to be taken in those times of extraordinary difficulty, providing we are all aware that this is special and does not last for a prolonged period of time.
I suppose just for the record, Convener, I should point out that in a former life I was a mental health officer that was very closely involved in the compulsory detention of people who needed compulsory care and treatment. So it was quite hard to read many of the hard-won gains for patients and their rights that we now, through necessity, in some circumstances may have to step back for that, but the reassurance from the Cabinet Secretary about how that will be monitored and reported is indeed helpful. The Cabinet Secretary earlier this morning intimated the Scottish Government's involvement with the development of this bill. He may want to say a bit more about that in terms of how that was secured. But I also wonder who has he involved in his deliberations, particularly around how we safeguard human rights. There are many well-established stakeholders and human rights organisations close at hand in Scotland.
Yes, the bill's genesis lies in preparations made some time ago for emergency legislation in case of flu or a pandemic. This bill was able, therefore, to be picked up and populated with more as a result of that process, and then a very urgent process of consultation with the four governments. It has not been possible for them to undertake much more than a fairly cursory stakeholder engagement with this in terms of finding out from expert groups exactly what would and wouldn't work. I think the opportunity now exists to have a longer conversation about it, but we need to get it on the statute book, and then we need to have a conversation about how it's implemented. That's unusual, but we need to have a conversation and for people to be sensitive to that conversation. I took the opportunity last week, as you probably know, because I think I mentioned it in a statement last week, speaking to the Scottish Human Rights Commission, just to make sure they were aware of our thinking and we were aware of their thinking on this. We recognise the exceptional circumstances that we are in. What we do need to do is to be aware of their concerns and the wider stakeholder concerns there, and to make sure that we're building that into, for example, our reporting procedures. And I've made them a commitment to undertake these reporting procedures and to make sure that the renewal is the 6 monthly, not the 2 yearly. And we will consult others. I know there's a lot of legal thinking going on about this, and we need to be sensitive to that as well. We also need, and I make the point very deliberately, we also need to get on and do this, because this is vital in terms of protecting communities and individuals. And there's a balance to be struck. We accept that balance, but we need to get on and do it.
Okay. I'm very conscious, Cabinet Secretary, that you're not the Cabinet Secretary for everything. But I do wonder if you're able to say something about the Protection of Vulnerable Groups scheme. There is very helpful correspondence between the Education Committee and the Deputy First Minister, which I've paid very close attention, but I just thought for the purpose of this morning's proceedings, if you were able to say anything about why the measures have been put in place or will be put in place and why they're necessary.
Yes, I mean, as we are both aware, I've been involved in the Protection of Vulnerable Groups issue in another life, as well as the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Lifelong Learning. There is a need for us to continue to ensure that those who are working with children are scrutinised, and we make sure that they are there for the right reasons and in the right way. Equally, we are aware that the system may not operate as effectively or efficiently as it has done in the past, because there may be a shortage of staff, for example, in all these circumstances. Now, what we're trying to do in here is to do a temporary disapplication of disclosure offences, but still to make sure that it will be possible to get information. And by that I mean that we may not, for example, on a check, be able to give the full background, but we will be able to say whether somebody's on the register or not. And that may give some guidance to it. But equally, we will only do this as we require to do it, right? We have to issue a direction to suspend 2 offences in the protection of vulnerable groups, and that's what we will do. But we will do it only if we absolutely need to do so. And the intention would to assist NHS boards to quickly recruit and deploy temporarily registered healthcare staff into frontline roles, and it could be used in social care as well to provide emergency cover. But we are aware of the difficulties that this, people would be concerned about, so it will only be done in those circumstances and done sparingly.
Okay, but for the avoidance of doubt, Disclosure Scotland will report to Police Scotland any barred individual that seeks to exploit the pandemic.
Yeah, we will be very sensitive, and there are procedures to be sensitive to make sure that we are not being put in a position where anybody would be trying to misuse it. We can reclassify disclosure requests so that the information given is less comprehensive, but we can make sure that that happens.
Okay, and my final question, Convener, is there is many examples in the LCM and legislation of where duties are reduced to powers or where there will be the suspension of legal duties in many areas that are designed to support vulnerable adults and children. Now, I understand that, in particular, laying aside duties to provide, for example, particular social work assessments, that is to enable a flexible and fast response during the pandemic to actually try and get support to those who need it. But I just wondered, again, if you were able to speak to how we will, in working very closely with local authorities, actually assure that that works in practice.
Yes, the concern has been expressed that this might be a provision that allowed local authorities essentially to dispense with the type of detailed consideration that they need to undertake. It is only there to make sure that there are not undue delays. You know, if undue delays took place because they were required to complete an assessment, that would be not in the interests of the individuals concerned. But it is not a blanket removal of the obligation on local authorities to make sure that assessments take place, and it is certainly not a blanket opportunity for local authorities to refuse to assess, which I think is what people fear. I know local authorities won't do that, but this is absolutely focused on saying, you know, we shouldn't delay the process of assessment until it is completed, and every T crossed and I dotted in order to get help to people, and that's what it's intended to do. And it is a temporary power, and again, we'll report on its use.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Alec Rowley? Just give it... It's okay. Just make sure your microphone was on.
Thank you. Firstly, the first question is around I saw that in England, the NHS have negotiated a deal with the private sector. Do you have the powers here either to negotiate a deal or to commandeer facilities and staff that are in the private NHS sector?
Well, the bill would allow you to do so, but I understand, and again, you know, I only understand from discussion I've been part of, that there's a very much smaller private sector in Scotland, about 200 beds, and that process has taken place.
Okay. And my second question is, I got an email in this morning for the joint trade unions in Fife, and they say, and I quote, "Our members in social care here in Fife are struggling to get basic PPE." Now, there is a need for some kind of centralised distribution and some sort of centralised overview of this. If those frontline workers, and it's not just there, we mentioned police earlier, I thought the Chief Constable the other day was excellent, where he was making very clear that his officers, where we had the problem with the pubs, that they would. So if we're going to empower all these different workers, and we're calling them key priority workers, but in this case, frontline social care workers aren't getting the protection that they need for themselves, what can you do about that? Does this legislation allow you to do more about that?
No, well, this legislation is required to allow us to do that because everything is being done to try and do that. I know that there is a huge push on to make sure that if there are places where the PPE material has not yet reached, that it will reach there. I mean, I've dealt with the case in my own constituency over the weekend. Everybody is pushing very hard to make sure that that happens. Where there are any blockages or shortages, material is being transferred, and they're trying to make sure that as that material reaches where it is needed as quickly as possible. And it is happening, but where it's not happening, people are quite right to say, we need it now. Everybody's working hard to try and get it there. Everybody.
And is there, just at that point, is there like a central command, if you like?
The Chief Medical Officer, you know, is absolutely apprised of what needs to be done and is making sure it is done. And you heard the Health Secretary say last week in the Chamber that whenever she's notified of where there are problems, she is getting involved to make sure those problems are solved. Nobody is withholding material, trying to get material out as quickly as possible and trying to source material, you know, where it is possible to do so as quickly as possible. Everybody wants that done and everybody's trying to get it done.
Good. Thank you, Alec. A supplementary, I think, from Angela. Constance.
Yeah, it's just, Cabinet Secretary, I wouldn't want you to leave the Finance Committee without any of us asking you about money. The bill says that the costs will be met by Parliament, and I suppose what consideration if any, have you given to, should the total costs amount to more than the 780 million in consequentials?
We will have to spend what we require to spend in these circumstances, and that is a discussion that is taking place and with the UK government, and they are absolutely aware of it. We've set aside funds. The funds are set aside in the UK government's budget. We liaise, I suspect, on a daily, if not hourly, basis with the Treasury. We are passing on money as soon as we are able to do so, and taking account of sometimes slightly different Scottish circumstances from what a UK announcement will be, and we'll go on doing so. This isn't a situation in which we can sit back and say we're not going to do things until the money is there. They will be done, but of course we will have to make sure that the money is available to pay, and those are the discussions that are taking place.
Okay, thank you.
Cabinet, I've just got one other area to cover, and maybe a couple of suggestions that might be useful to follow up on. You'll be aware, because we discussed over the weekend the fact that so many people had not taken cognizance of the social distancing and essential travel guidance that had been provided by governments. That in parts of your constituency, in parts of my constituency, like Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park, in the Highlands and many other areas, I understand down in the eastern former fishing villages as well in Scotland, were overwhelmed by the number of visitors and concerned about the number of camper vans and motorhomes which were in these areas. What powers do already exist or will exist as a result of the bill to help control these situations? I think it's unlikely it will happen again, but if it does, what powers would exist?
Well, we can ensure that camping grounds and public access grounds are closed. I think the former Forestry Commission, the Forest and Land Scotland, has closed its camping and recreational areas as of now to camper vans and others. Some places are open to people to walk, but not to stop and to park up. Those powers exist, and those powers can be used, and they will be used. Quite clearly, there are people who are legitimately in places, but the requirements on exercise, what has been talked about, the rules that the FM talked about yesterday, need to be observed, and that changes how people go about and do things. In the islands, as you know, you and I have discussed it over the weekend too, that's been a huge issue on the islands. Caledonia and McBrain is now, and the ferries operated by others are now absolutely clear there is no non-essential travel. But in case anybody needs it said even more bluntly to them, just don't. Just don't move about. Just don't think that you can behave with impunity. Please do not do so. People will be welcome when this is over, but they cannot come now to any of those places because it is foolish. There was an incredibly foolish, extraordinarily foolish piece in an English newspaper. There was another one in an English magazine yesterday. What people need to realise is this is utterly irresponsible. Stay away. Not least because, for example, in the Highlands and Islands, as you know, as parts of your own constituency, there are limited resources in terms of supporting the population. They cannot be put under more pressure.
The other couple of points are just, I think, points for you to take it away that have been brought to my attention. Whether it's bed and breakfast, caravan parks, holiday, cottage businesses, the issue of insurance and interrupted businesses is really concerning, and a lot of them feel that they will not be able to secure the necessary resource from insurances unless specific stop orders, for want of a better description, are put in place. I'm also aware that it's the same in regard to football clubs, and I know some people might not think that's a high priority at this stage, but they employ a lot of people. And unless there's some sort of order or directive that comes from the government, then potentially the broadcasters would be more resistant. I hope they're not, in paying out the broadcasting money. So they might still seek from you the opportunity to have orders or directives made to them, even although they're closed already and they've done that voluntarily.
There will be an awful lot of things that need to be done.
I'm aware of that.
Right? And if we don't need to do something because it's happened already, then we shouldn't do it. I hope any bureaucratic organisation that's sitting back and saying we're not doing anything until you show us a piece of paper stamped in triplicate stops that immediately. As far as we are concerned, these places are closed because they have to be closed. And therefore, there is no dubiety about it. And this bill will give power to close those who don't listen, but those who have listened shouldn't be penalised. So, be sensible about this and operate in a way that recognises the extraordinary emergency we're engaged in. And don't wait for somebody else to give you something else that you need.
That's a fair comment. And Cabinet Secretary, can I say thank you very much for being able to deal with so much detail questions, which weren't always about the specifics in the bill. Much of it was. We already agreed, Cabinet Secretary, an earlier session of the committee to go into not take the next item in private and do it in public. So I now move to item 3 on the Corona Bill UK legislation. I invite the committee to agree to recommend to the Scottish Parliament that the Parliament agrees that the relevant provisions of the Coronavirus Bill introduced in the House of Commons on the 19th of March 2020, so far as they fall within legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament or alter the executive competence of the Scottish Ministers, should be considered by the UK Parliament. In order to inform the Chamber debate this afternoon on the withdrawal agreement, I invite members to agree that we will write to the Scottish Government confirming our decision and publish that letter on our website as soon as possible. Are members agreed? Members are agreed. I thank you very much for your time. We'll have a short pause.
The legislative consent motion will be taken this afternoon. In the light of that, thank you for that. And we hope to have this concluded by the end of the working day.
Thank you very much. We'll just have a short pause.